Hello, everyone. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. That working? See
Yes.
things? Awesome.
Yes, for sure.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for spending your what we're assuming is possibly a lunch break with us, although depending on where you're coming in from, the time will be different. But I'm just really excited to have a chance to talk to everyone about this new project that we've started undertaking. It's exciting to me for a few different reasons. It's for one, it's at the intersection of public safety, public land management, and bird conservation. It also happens to be extremely local, and it taps into Manomet Conservation Sciences' long history of work in the area, particularly in this exact study area. So, hopefully that we just concluded our field season a couple weeks ago, and I'm still compiling data for it, but this is kind of a sneak peek into some of those results, but also just background on exactly what the heck we've been doing out there. Yeah, thank you all for joining, and we'll have some time at the end for questions if you want to throw those in the Q&A or chat or something like that. I don't know. So
Yep,
anyways.
Q&A would be great.
Awesome. Okay. So a little bit of background here. Um, what are pine barrens? So if anyone's coming to us digitally, locally, maybe you'll be excited to learn, if you didn't know already, that you live very close to, if not within, a globally rare ecosystem. So pine barrens are basically a forested or semi-forested landscape that are kind of basically they occur in areas that have very poor soil. So in the case of southeastern Massachusetts, these are glacial deposits, very sandy soil. They're characterized by open canopies, and they tend to be pine dominated. These ecosystems are often fire dependent, which means that they rely upon fire to maintain that open canopy. A lot of the species there are they're specifically adapted to thrive in an environment like this. So the pines often are able to withstand fire. Shrubby vegetation comes back very quickly after a burn, and a lot of the animals in their life cycles are they evolve around this fire, regular fire as well. So here in southeastern Mass, we've got a lovely pine barrens. Other famous pine barrens are things like the New Jersey pine barrens. You could also think of the pine barrens that are the longleaf pine forests that occur down in, if you've been down in the southeastern United States, think of sort of Georgia through northern Florida, west to Louisiana. They're often home to endangered species because this ecosystem is incredibly rare. So it's rare because it's reliant upon that fire. Over the last 150, 200 years, humans have really suppressed that fire generally. Because of that, these have really given way to succession. So non-fire tolerant plants have come in and have started outcompeting the local things. Also, development has removed a lot of pine barrens from our landscape. So typically, pine barrens were not a place that people wanted to build on too much because sandy soil is kind of hard to build on, but modern technology makes that possible. And also, if you develop near a pine barrens, you're going to want to suppress fires nearby as well, in most cases, because you've basically built your house around an area that is meant to burn every once in a while. Um, yeah, so interesting, very dynamic landscape. Um, it's something that, like I said, there's a long history of fire suppression. But just like you read about in the West with a lot of areas where there's fire suppression that means buildup of fuel, that has basically happened in the southeastern Massachusetts pine barrens as well. The fires that have occurred accidentally within the southeastern Massachusetts pine barrens have often gone out of control, and that's because of suppression, there's just so much fuel in there. So this image on the left is an area that hasn't had any burn or anything take place in over 50 years. Um, but recently, the state through DCR has enacted a 10-year plan to begin vegetation thinning in these areas. So they thin out the canopy by removing mostly the non-fire tolerant trees, leaving, in this case, pitch pines, which are the pine barrens dominant pine tree, in place, and removing a lot of the vegetation. Initially, if they were just to set fire to this, it would kind of go out of control and be pretty dangerous. So often, actually in all these cases, they've gone in and thinned out the vegetation mechanically. So with these enormous machines that basically masticate or basically turn to wood chips a lot of the larger non-fire tolerant trees. And then after that, after the thinning happens, regular burns are set in place to maintain the shrub layer and basically maintain a habitat that looks something along these lines. So this is an area on the right that has been thinned but not burned. This area on the right was thinned about a year ago. And you can see that there is a healthy shrub layer, but it's the end result is something that's much more sparse. So it's a very labor-intensive project or a very labor-intensive undertaking. And it drastically alters the landscape. And it's something that is also happening on public lands. So this is all happening within Myles Standish State Forest, which is used for recreation quite often, pretty heavily. And so public perception plays into this as well. And there are varying opinions on whether this process is a good thing or a bad thing. But from our perspective here at Manomet, we have history in working in this system after fire, and we're very curious to know how the birds are responding and to document this. And we're fortunate enough to come in touch with MassWildlife and DCR, and we've actually been working with them to develop a plan to monitor how birds are responding to this. So this is, again, the sort of intersection of, public safety, but also wildlife management and recreation management as well. So I say Manomet has a history here. We actually, in the early 1970s, there was a relatively small fire that took place in the southeastern portion of Myles Standish State Forest. And Manomet ornithologists, led by previous land bird conservation director Trevor Lloyd Evans, went out to the Pine Barrens and basically did a whole bunch of what we call territory mapping. So they went to an area that had just burned, and this had burned so intensely because of all the fuel that every plant in there had died. So they basically had something that's just from the ground up, just a total blank slate. And then from that point, they also looked at other sites that they'd known had burned 10 years prior and some sites that had not burned for much longer. So we had sort of baseline indications of how birds respond to burns. These studies took place over 2 years, and we published the reports in some breeding bird surveys, and we also published some internal reports. But we're very curious to know if the management practices undertaken by the state are actually something that is mimicking the natural processes. And we want to know if the bird responses are the same or if they're different now. At the very least, we want some sort of baseline as to how birds might respond. So we selected birds, obviously, because we're bird people, but birds are also just really amazing indicators of ecological change. And so the species that we're looking at, we know that they prefer more open areas. They tend to nest either very low to the ground or on the ground. So that shrubby vegetation that's particularly dense is very beneficial to their nesting success. We're very interested in learning how not only breeding birds use the habitat, but also how they use the habitat after they fledge. So the fledging period, post-fledging period for many songbirds is a very risky period of time. They're figuring the world out. They're learning how to feed themselves. They're learning how to find food. and to avoid predators. And a lot of birds after fledging tend to head to food-rich areas that provide a lot of cover. So this could very well relate to some of the habitat restoration work that's happening. And so our focal species for this were common yellowthroat, the one in the upper left. It's an adult male eastern towhee on the right, and the lower left is a photo of an adult male prairie warbler. Um, Another bird that we're interested in learning how its population has changed since the work we did in the 1970s is the pine warbler, there's one on the lower right here. Pine warblers they nest higher up in typically white pine trees. They are very common in areas where pitch pine scrub oak forests have been taken over by white pines. Anecdotally, prior to this work, we'd noticed a whole lot more pine warblers in the area of these studies. So we were curious how they might play into it as well. Um, okay, so I realize I'm talking about this site and not actually, I haven't really set the stage for where we're actually doing this work. So this is basically in southeastern Massachusetts. Maybe you can see it, this little white block on the map. This is basically where this map is coming from, but this is a map of Myles Standish State Forest, and the area that's being managed as part of this restoration work is about 1,100 acres in the southeastern portion of Myles Standish State Forest. So it's near the Charge Pond and Fearing Pond camping loops. It's near Camp Squanto, and it also encompasses the newly acquired state acquired Camp Catch-A-Lot, which is in the extreme southeastern portion. And so they're sort of separated into a bunch of different tracts here. And these are sort of the treatment areas for these vegetation removal and possibly controlled burn management strategies. We basically used this map, and we used a map showing sort of the chronology of what they've done so far. And we basically selected these sites here as our different treatment areas. So area A is sort of about a year removed from vegetation removal. B is 2 years, C is 3, D and E are 5 years, and then F is our control, which is an area that hasn't really been burned in probably over 50 years at this point. So we've got these different treatment levels. Each of these circles here represents a survey area. Each of the circles is where we're going to, or where we have done, and we will next year as well, conduct something called a point count, where an observer stands in the middle of that point for 10 minutes and records all of the birds they see and hear. We do that 3 times throughout the breeding season, and that's what we use to compile information on how birds are using a larger landscape. We're also interested, since we do bird banding here at Manomet, and we've got the permits and we have the expertise and we have the curiosity. We also set up 2 banding stations, one in A right here and one down in section D as well. And these are 2 sites where we set up under 10 mist nets. And we basically tried to use a protocol called the MAPS protocol, which stands for Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship. That's a protocol developed by the Institute for Bird Populations. It's used all throughout the continent, really all throughout the hemisphere. And it's basically designed to collect information on breeding birds and their young. And ideally, it would take place over a long period of time. Currently, we're planning on 2 years. We'll see if we are able to continue that work as well. But over that time, we can see what types of birds are breeding, how the birds are using the habitat, and also get some information on return rates as well next year. The last thing we did at a subset of each of these red circles was conducting vegetation surveys, which we're using as or which we will use as covariates for analyzing our bird abundance data. Um, and so our field methods are things like this is a point count data sheet here. And you can see we basically have a little map there with the 50 and 100-meter circles. And we basically record every bird that we see or hear within that and have a specific code system for determining whether it's a singing bird, whether it's a male or female, whether birds move. You can see here this is a field sparrow that was about 80 meters away. That was a singing male and it flew a little bit closer. So that's what all that stuff is. We also used mist nets as part of our maps banding. And then the vegetation surveys were sort of a three-tiered approach. We looked at herbaceous cover, which is what this square is. But we also looked at a shrub layer, which is pretty significant in some of these areas with scrub oaks. And then we looked at larger tree size and canopy cover as well. So those were our field methods. I can give you a little taste of some of our preliminary findings here. I will say for the point counts, we're still entering the point count data. So I don't have any real number crunching here for you, but sort of anecdotally, these are some sort of impressions that we got. So first and foremost, the estimates of breeding bird densities are relatively even across all the treatments. That said, the species composition is something that is different within these areas. For instance, eastern towhees were far more common in the areas that had just recently burned. They moved in almost immediately after the burns and started building nests again. So one of these sections was actually burned in, I believe, late May this past year. And even though nesting had initiated for some of these species, they came right back, and that's one of the spots we were banding birds, the southeastern section we were banding birds. And we were catching breeding birds, just a couple weeks after the burn had taken place. So these birds are also highly adapted for this ecosystem. So yeah, it seems like certain birds like eastern towhees rapidly respond to vegetation removal and or burns, but other species lag in their responses. So birds, the other target species, things like prairie warblers and common yellowthroats in particular, occurred in pretty low densities in the areas that had sort of actively been managed. We actually found a fair amount of yellowthroats in the area that hadn't been burned in 50 years. And so this implies we have to look at the numbers, the actual numbers, but it implies to me that there's sort of an inflection point for a lot of these species as far as sort of length after burn. And just like with anything else in ecology, there's a fair amount of complexity, and you can't just manage for one species. But yeah, another interesting takeaway from this is that chipping sparrows are one of the more common singing species, and actually we'll see in a second, they're also one of the more common species in our nets. And in the 1973 or 72 and 73 work that we did, there were no chipping sparrows. So this is a species that is probably on the rise in the East. It is a species that coexists with humans fairly well. And we think that they tend to be expanding into areas like this as well as a result of maybe those suburban populations. So that's sort of our assessment of the point count data. We also have some preliminary results from our banding. So this is our summer intern, Camille Beckwith. Here she is banding I'm not sure, I'm assuming chipping sparrow given the location. But we did capture a fair amount we captured all of our focal species, but only eastern towhees were of sort of a relatively decent number. What we found with our nets was the areas, not surprisingly, were incredibly exposed. And with the hot temperatures over the summer combined with the exposure to winds, nets were often closed for bird safety prematurely in the day. So it was difficult to get a full sample rate for all of these sites. That said, we caught over 150 or caught and banded over 150 birds. And these are things like, oh, I guess these are quiz birds. These are all juvenile birds here. This one on the left is a juvenile pine warbler. This is a juvenile chipping sparrow, juvenile common yellowthroat, and a juvenile male eastern towhee. Um, the first set of plumage that birds have is often very loosely textured, but also helps camouflage them. They'll replace this pretty soon thereafter, but it was pretty cool that we were catching them both in their full juvenile plumages as well as during that molt as well. So we were seeing initiation of molt as well, which is an indication that there are ample food resources for those animals in that habitat. Here's like a fun little cloud here. So one of our banding sites was in an area that just had vegetation removed, but no burn. And the other site had just had a burn a few months prior. And the overall usage of the area and the overall sample size is about the same, but the species composition is very different. And we found a lot of particularly juvenile birds moving around through the area that did not burn, but only had the vegetation removed. And I'm pretty sure that's because they were going after the berries that were there. There are two species of vaccinium of blueberry, that low bush blueberry that recover after fire, as well as huckleberry as well. So those are really abundant food resources for these birds. And we captured a ton of American robins that were taking advantage of that food resource in the area that had not burned. These plants will not fruit on burned over stems, and they also tend not to fruit on the first year's growth after burn. So what we found was more ground foraging birds, things like eastern towhees and brown thrashers, using the area that had just burned. So if you think of the bird landscape, it's sort of emerging vegetation that has caterpillars and whatnot on it, and then also insects that are underneath the chunks of ash and bark that have fallen off. So ground foraging species really partook in the open burned areas, but pretty interesting. Of the 156 birds we banded, 83 of those birds were young birds. And we'll see next year how many of those birds come back to the same area, and we'll see how many of the 70 so birds that we banded that were adult birds, how many of those come back as well. So here's an illustration of some Vaccinium pallidum that's come up after some vegetation removal on the right, and the left is a bird bag, and kind of hard to tell from the photo maybe, but I thought it was a good photo because the bird bag has blueberries on it in more ways than one. They're printed on there, but also there's some blueberry poop soaking through, and that's a robin that we're bringing back to the banding station. So again, these areas with fruit, they're super open, really good for foraging for these birds. But, very excited to get back out there next year. We're wondering whether or not we can tie in maybe some other work on species of brown thrasher out there. But that said, very interesting to get out there to start work in our own backyard in a globally rare ecosystem on birds that we have a lot of experience with. So I guess with that, I will open it up to some questions. And I want to thank our partners at DCR and MassWildlife, as well as Wheaton College. And in this image here, there's some Wheaton College students helping us out as part of one of their summer field courses. So it was a really fun experience out there for all of us with that.
That was great, Evan. Thank you so much.
I hope I didn't talk too fast.
Manomet scientists tend to talk quite quickly to get it all in, for sure. I'm going to agree with Jan Spence from the Pine Hills, who opined that she can always learn something from Evan. I'm lucky enough to share an office across the hall from him, and I'm learning from him every day. So let's get to some questions. In the Q&A, let's see, we have, how will the massive sand mining operation in Carver plus the additional proposed sand mining project in Plymouth near the Myles Standish border affect the viability of the species there?
Good question.
Mhm.
That's not a spot that I'm working at, but it's possible that I know that, just like the Pine Barrens, well, I was talking about how the Pine Barrens form on basically sandy soil. If anyone's got a garden in Plymouth as well and tries digging in their backyard, they basically it's just a pile of sand. So there is some profit to be made from collecting sand and whatnot from areas that are dug out. I'm not aware of exactly how close it is to our study areas, but the beauty of long-term monitoring is that if it takes place over a long enough period of time, you can figure out how things happen. Unfortunately, in our case, we're just in year one, so I can't necessarily tell you how it's going to play out, but maybe come back in a little while and maybe we'll see some differences.
Okay, thank you. How about, I've got another, how long do these birds tend to live?
Yeah, great question. So that's something that programs like MAPS can actually tell us. But through MAPS, we know that a lot of the passerines that nest in the northeastern United States, a lot of them are either short distance migrants, like the eastern towhee will migrate south to the maybe mid-Atlantic or southeastern U.S. But something like a prairie warbler is something that's going to go all the way down to the Bahamas or some island in the Caribbean, probably. So, their survivorship kind of varies on the risks that they encounter. But generally, you can count or you can assume that many of these birds will only live if they get past their first year. Well, I guess, okay. Many of these birds will perish in their first year of life. But the ones that do make it through tend to last a fair amount longer. We've had birds returning to the banding lab here at Manomet that are anywhere from 7 to 8 years old if they're neotropical migrants. And then resident species can live a lot longer. We have a much higher chance of catching them. But generally, I would say on average, maybe they only get 2 or 3 breeding seasons. So they've got to be successful in that period of time or else they won't replace themselves.
Okay, thanks, Evan. I have a question in the chat that says, let's see, pine warblers tend to stay higher up in the veg. Did you see much difference between banding data and point count for pine warblers?
Yeah, great question. Again, we haven't really compiled our data from the point counts. That said, pine warblers, although they were one of the more common species that we saw while we were out banding, you're absolutely right that they do spend their time higher up in the trees. It's where they nest. It's typically where they forage. So we didn't catch too many pine warblers in our nets because our nets were only about 2, 3 meters up off the ground. So great question.
Okay, and I have another question. Are any systematic counts being done on whippoorwill?
Yeah, great question. So, a lot of work has been done not just in Myles Standish, but also in other pine barrens habitats around. There have been bird surveys done on Edwards Air Force Base, as well as in the sand plains of Montague, which is out in the central part of the state. If you haven't been out there, I suggest going. It's pretty awesome. It looks kind of like someone dropped these areas in the middle of Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts. But again, it's sort of a glacial sand plain that the only thing that could really colonize there was pitch pines. But what you have are these areas where there's lots of dense vegetation and then areas where only scrubby vegetation can survive. And those areas are really important areas for the species of nocturnal bird, the whippoorwill. If anyone's camped out in Myles Standish, you might have heard them. It's one of the last places in the county that in the area in southeastern Massachusetts that you can reliably encounter whippoorwills. Um, But yeah, I think the state has done a fair amount of work tracking whippoorwills and figuring out the types of habitats they use. As far as Myles Standish, the state has been collecting data from driving transects, so nocturnal surveys done by volunteers. But no sort of, aside from those surveys, as far as I know, there aren't any plans for more sort of intensive applied research on whippoorwills in the forest.
Okay, thanks, Evan. How about from our own Tim Sharp? What might be the impact of the spraying for the triple E mosquitoes in Plymouth affect this area? Birds, wildlife? Any idea?
Yeah, I guess, as far as systematic spraying goes, the question is what's getting sprayed, right? So once you know it's getting sprayed, you can kind of figure out how it may affect things. I will say it's fortunate at least that that spraying gets done at night as opposed to when the mosquitoes are more active, as opposed to spraying that takes place during the day, say by your local mosquito squad guy who works 9 to 5. But yeah, I mean, insect abundances and pesticide use are we think one of the major drivers of declines in songbird species, particularly animals that really only consume insects. So things like the whippoorwill we were just talking about, that not only consume insects, but consume flying insects, which are particularly vulnerable to pesticide applications. And whippoorwills will be flying around at night catching insects while they're getting sprayed by pesticides. So, I don't know exactly what the effects are, and it would take a lot of work to really parse out what those are. So I'm not going to really speculate on it. Um, but but yeah, I mean, birds need a lot of insects to survive. So there's that.
Thank you. How about, let's see. Actually, Evan, do you mind stop your screen sharing so we can see you in full color?
Oh, okay, sure.
There we go.
Did that work?
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. Thank you
Awesome.
so much. All right, another question. So let's see. So those pines, do they have to be burned to open, to open the pine cones for the seeds? That's a good question.
Good question. Yeah, some pine species require fire. So you see that in a lot of Western species, and I believe also uh, in the southeastern U.S. that needs to happen. I think with longleaf pine, maybe. Pitch pine cones will open on their own. Sometimes they're even opened with little help from a red crossbill, which is a species of bird that nests in the forest, and they've got a cross-shaped bill that helps them pry open the seeds. They drop a lot of them, it would seem, but yeah, it doesn't. Fire is not required for that to take place. Um,
Okay, thank you. Another question about the pine warbler, that they tend to stay higher up in the veg than EATO. I'm not a bird person. Evan will know what that
Eastern
means.
towhee, yep,
Okay.
yep.
Or PRAW.
Prairie warbler, yep.
Okay. Did you see much difference between banding and point count for the pine warbler?
Yeah, so that's similar to earlier. So yes, exactly. There is some there are several inherent biases in the nets that we use. So another thing we noticed was we were using sort of standard size nets for the MAPS protocols. But we were noticing that the size mesh of the net was a little small to be catching some
Mm.
of the larger species. So we're pretty sure that things like brown thrashers and even some eastern towhees, which are a little around the same size as a catbird, we're pretty sure they were getting out of the net at a higher rate than normal. So we may actually increase the size of the mesh next year. But yeah, there are some biases in mist nets. So height is the big one, but also mesh size as well as to what you might catch.
Okay. Um, Greg Power asked the question, is they're monitoring in the birds' winter habitats?
Yeah, good question. So, overwinter monitoring takes place under a few different programs. So, uh, primarily within North America, but it's started to take place globally at this point. But there's the Christmas bird count which takes place, and those data have been used to assess overwintering bird populations within the United States because we've got abundance data for birds for over 100 years. And those types of data sets are pretty hard to come by, pretty invaluable in determining that. As far as in the overwintering areas beyond our borders, there is a similar protocol to maps called MOSI, also hosted, at least for now, by the Institute for Bird Populations. And that is meant to monitor both the breeding birds that are in sort of the neotropics north of the equator, as well as overwintering birds from North America. So birds that breed in North America and overwinter in the neotropics. So there are a few different protocols for that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Evan. How about do you know what the dominant pine tree type in Myles Standish is?
In the areas that are managed, it's pitch pine. So it's
Okay.
Pinus, I think it's resinosa.
Okay. How about what's a typical fire regime? How many years is ideal between fires in the habitat?
So I think ideal varies. I think a lot of these fires sort of take place on an opportunistic basis to some extent. I think ideally the plan is an 8-year cycle. But over the course of these 2 years, we're actually going to get the chance, I think, to determine if maybe something like a 10-year cycle might be better. So it's possible that by year 8 or 10, that's really the sweet spot for something like a prairie warbler. Whereas if it's burned prior to that, it might not be ideal.
Okay,
Thanks,
thanks.
thanks, Frank. It's Pinus rigida. Thank you.
Okay. Pinus rigida. How about are the results from the 70s study
I work with
published?
birds, I guess.
Yeah, right. We can't be experts in everything. Are results from the 70s studies published publicly, do you know? And will the current results be published? We do tend to publish our work. I don't know.
Yeah. So we're pretty committed to making our information that we publish as accessible as possible as an organization. It's something we've been working towards. A lot of our historic sort of publications that were internal are not super easy to find, and that's not because we're trying to hide them. It's mostly because they're in a closet, buried in a closet somewhere in our basement, and have yet to be scanned. So I do have digital copies of both of these reports. I can certainly, if they are not already, I can certainly slap them up on our website. But if you look at Manomet's website, there's a pretty decent catalog of the work that we've done, that we've made available either in sort of PDF form or a web link.
Perfect. Thanks, Evan. I'm just going to take a couple more questions. Birds are a host of triple E. Are the avian populations in this region affected much by triple E? I guess, did we talk about that already? Mortality rates, for example.
Yeah, so we find, particularly with things like West Nile virus, certain bird species are far more susceptible to death due to that. So that we find, I think with West Nile, it tends to be corvids, so things like jays and crows that get hit particularly hard. Birds tend to be really good at surviving a lot of stuff. Their metabolisms are super high, and they're capable of amazing physical feats. So their immune systems are kind of in overdrive all the time. It just happens that certain birds or certain species can sometimes be more susceptible. I'm not entirely sure if triple E has a certain clade of birds that it affects more strongly, but birds are often carriers for things. This is why things like bird flu are forefront of our minds, because birds can often be carriers of things that you wouldn't that wouldn't necessarily kill them. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure whether encephalitis has hit their population super hard. I'd have to look into that.
Thank you. How about, let's see, one or two more questions. Is the eastern towhee different than the rufous-sided towhee?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, if you yeah, it's one of those birds where the name has changed a few times. Eastern towhee used to include the rufous-sided towhee and the spotted towhee. Um, but I think they then split it and then lumped it and then split it again. I may have an additional lump or split in there. Um, but basically, we now have the spotted towhee in the west and the eastern towhee in the east. Um, but yeah, so actually, if you look back at our database of banding data here at Manomet, sometimes you'll encounter RSTO. And if you're not in the know, if you look on the paper data sheets and you're like, well, what did TLE band as an RSTO in 1978? That was the rufous-sided towhee at that point in time.
Keeper of all the knowledge, Evan. Thank you so much. Let's see. Well, I'll take one more question, which is,
These are great questions.
they
Thank
are
you all
great
for
questions.
paying attention enough to actually ask thoughtful questions. Awesome.
How the last question is, how long will you follow the bird communities in these sites? What's the
Yeah, great question. So currently we're on a 2-year contract. We'll have to see how things play out. Ideally, this is a system that's basically in our backyard, and we have such history there and institutional expertise regarding the communities there. I would love to see this be something that sort of takes place at some level in perpetuity. But we'll have to sort of see how that shakes out. Is this the point where like ask everyone for money? I'm not in development, so I don't know.
I'm gonna do that. Thank you. Evan, thank you so much for sharing this work and everyone online for your interest and your questions. Thanks so much for being here. If you want more Manomet, you can visit our events page. First Friday Bird Walk hosted by our own Evan in September is fully booked, but our director of the Coastal Zone Initiative, Mike Molinar, is coordinating an international beach cleanup day at Whitehorse Beach on Saturday, September 21st. We'd love to have your help pitching in to keep our local beach clean. And visit our website, manomet.org, or join the conversation on Facebook or Instagram. This small sit's going to be up on YouTube channel, so if you want to share it with someone, you can send the link. And also, if you enjoyed today, we'd love for you to support our work directly with a donation online if you haven't already. And if you do contribute between now and the end of September, your gift is going to be doubled, thanks to a group of generous supporters who have provided matching funds that will double your gift dollar for dollar. So we'd love for you to do that if you find it in your hearts to do so. And now I just want to thank again all of our attendees and Evan for that great presentation. And we at the Small Sit are signing off. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.